What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of the Sit Down. As always, if you enjoy this video and you're watching it on YouTube, make sure you hit that like button and let me know what you think of the discussion in the comment section below. If you're checking out the show on iTunes, Spotify, or Google Pods, make sure you subscribe. Leave us a detailed review. Let us know what you think of the show. What's up, ladies and gentlemen? We are back here with another episode of the Sit Down. I am your host, Jeff Nadu, and we are powered, as always, by Barstool Sports. We are back and better than ever. Got another great show planned for you today, and it's back to the world of the American Mafia. Today, we're going to delve into a very interesting and colorful character, a man who today we could probably say is one of the more popular people in the world of the American Mafia. The question is he still associated with the American mob? We're going to delve into his life and find out. And he's been, interestingly enough, the focal point of a recent bizarre photograph with the former president of the United States, Donald Trump. We'll get into all that and more. And as always, is customary on the show, we like to bring in a great guest to have a great discussion with. And it's someone who's been on the show before. We've actually done some Philly shows. We did a show about the current leadership of the American Mafia around the country. It's none other than our friend, the great Scott Bernstein. You can find Scott Bernstein at the Gangster Report, one of the foremost authorities on the mafia, as well as on Twitter at Burnsy's tweets. Now, Scott, you are probably at this point one of the leading people in this space. You're a guy that, we always have good conversation. We're kind of on the same kind of thing at this point where we're looking at the same people. And I know you've always been fascinated by our subject today, Skinny Joey Merlino. How's everything with you? It's good to see you.
Good, man. And let me just shameless plug OG Podcast, wherever you consume podcasts. And Jeff's been on the podcast before. He's going to be coming on more content with us now that we're, fully, vertically integrated. And we're on YouTube. We weren't on YouTube for a while. We were just audio. We've been on YouTube now for about 6-7 months, and we're ramping up content and building subs. So we had a really, really strong audio following around the globe, over 1 million downloads audio. And then we made the transition to video, and it's going gangbusters.
It's interesting. I'm so kind of annoyed. I always have so much to say in the intro that that's a podcast that to me, regularly listen to. That's one of the ones I have in rotation. You and Jimmy Bucciolato do a great job. So yeah, check out the show, whether it's on, you're checking it out on pod or check it out on YouTube as well. You can see Scott's smiling face on a regular basis. So Scott, Joey Merlino, he's kind of an interesting guy. Obviously, if you're from where I live, the area that I live, you've heard of Joey Merlino. There's been everything from him being in a photograph with Donald Trump to surviving assassination attempts on the corner many years ago to being affiliated supposedly with an NHL star. Joey Merlino, for large parts of his career, has been a notorious individual. He's a guy that everybody wants to speak to. He never has a problem talking to reporters or the camera. And he always carried that John Gotti vibe, didn't he? But he was really the first of his kind to actually interview with people and do radio stuff. He's a fascinating character, isn't he?
Dare I say, John Gotti was a poor man's Joey Merlino. I mean, John Gotti had a 5-year run. Joey's going on his 4th decade in power. He's been in power now for 30 years, and he's only 60. This guy is an OG, man. He is an old school gangster living in the 21st century and, mixing it or melding it with what a 21st century wise guy is. Him and his whole crew have embraced social media, which is interesting. They all went to prison in around 2000. They all came out in, between 2010 and 2013, 14. And they all quickly jumped out. A lot of them quickly jumped out. Media.
Scott, it's interesting too with them and with him in particular, because there are a lot of things we hear about kind of some of the things he does, with sports stars or with a musician or something. But when we actually look at the career that he's allegedly had in the mafia, there's not a lot of like, this is what he did and this is what he was a part of. It's a lot of just, we're kind of unaware. So it's interesting to kind of delve into him and kind of talk about him, because we really haven't had a show where someone has delved into kind of his career and the fact that he was, as very involved. His father was involved. So what do you say we just jump into it? We'll start from the beginning with Joey and kind of get to present day. Joey Merlino on the sit down. Joey Merlino was born March 13th, 1962 in Philadelphia. Now, I always like to kind of describe, as you know, the landscape of what South Philly looks like. It's a very small neighborhood, right? Particularly the part where, you know, people like this congregate, the Merlinos, the Scarfos, the different names that we've heard over the years, the Angelo Brunos. It's all one particular area in and around Snyder Avenue, Broad Street, Argan Avenue, that area. Joey's father, obviously, as we know, was Salvatore Chucky Merlino. Now, Chucky was the underboss of the Scarfo crime family from the early 80s, really to around 1986. Joey has two sisters, didn't have a brother, just sisters. And if you've ever heard about his mother was a bit of a spitfire, wasn't she?
Yeah, Rita.
Rita, still alive today, I believe. Chucky has passed. It's been about 10 years since he passed. But, you know, just kind of a neighborhood group, a neighborhood family. Joey ran the streets, played sports, hockey, as he's talked about. He played for something called the Gladiators, which is a small youth hockey group. He talked about when he was a young kid, he went to the parades on Broad Street for the Flyers, and he fell in love with hockey. And he would make his friends, right? He would go to high school ultimately at St. Thomas Aquinas, which is in Point Breeze. It's actually a neighborhood to the left of where these guys were from.
I think he got booted as a junior.
Yeah, I've heard that. And this is where he would meet a lot of the friends that he had. And he had a lot of neighborhood friends in and around Jackson Street, Wolf Street, around 10th and 11th Street, around that neighborhood, right off Snyder Avenue, which is interesting because it's just a stone's throw away from Bruno's home. You know, it's within blocks. You know, people like Mikey Chang, Johnny Chang, Mazzone, like all these different people. They all kind of grew up together, which I think is really important.
It's very important. I think to what you were just, that little synopsis you just gave, I think is a great way to seed this conversation, because this is a group that have been with each other since the sandbox. Most of these guys, Joey's known since he was in elementary school. Joey is mob royalty, as you mentioned. His dad, Chucky Merlino, was the underboss. His godfather was Nicky Scarfo, who was the godfather. And it's also, I think, important to note that Nicky Scarfo, while he was the boss, was living in Atlantic City. So Chucky Merlino, even though he was the underboss, he was the #1 shot caller in Philadelphia.
And one of the reasons I always love to get Scott on, for anyone that doesn't know who he is, Scott wrote The Great Mafia Prince, one of the great books in mafia history involving really the story of Philip Leonetti and Nicky Scarfo. We had Scott on, I think it was our second episode. We talked about that. So, yeah, I think, you know, it's really important to understand, like in Joey's kind of teens, even late teens, by like the early 80s, his father is a high-ranking individual in one of the more powerful crime families on the East Coast, really outside of the five families. So when we say, and we talked about this when we did the Salvi Testa show, a lot of these guys, their fate is decided for them, essentially. You know, you live in, and I've talked about this with Mikey Scars or John Gotti Jr. These people, this is their life. This is what they're generally ingrained to do, and you don't blame them for doing it because everybody did it. It's all they know. So Joey, like everyone else, just kind of followed in the footsteps. Now, I want to talk about something that a lot of people don't know. In the late 70s, and I think you know this, Joey Merlino was actually a horse jockey.
Yeah, and he's pretty good. I think he won over 40 races.
40, yeah, he won 41 races in 3 years. And there's actually a pretty interesting photo on Google where he rode a horse called Four Bits at the old Keystone Racetrack. He ran in and out of the Philly area, you know, what Parks is today, and even up in New Jersey. And he was a pretty successful rider. If you know Joey, obviously his name is Skinny Joey. He's a little guy, right?
He's small. He's about 5'5".
Yeah. And your friend or someone you've known in the past, Philip Leonetti actually made a comment at one point that he used to call him Jose. Now, I don't know what.
I think it was a reference to.
Is that a right?
Hispanics are jockeys.
As a jockey, right? Because, and that's one thing we know about horse jockeys. Most of them are from Venezuela, Panama, Puerto Rico. So many great jockeys. And you have to be a little guy to do that, right? You're little, you know, compact, 5'4", 5'5" little guy.
You
and
also have to have balls.
Yes. And we know Joey had some balls. And, he's a guy that it's pretty interesting. That's a rare kind of thing to hear about, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I've been posed a question before, like, do you know of any gangsters that were like athletes, right? And
Yeah.
from what I understand, like I know, like Michael Franzese supposedly was a decent athlete. John Alight, we know he was a baseball
Yeah.
player. Al Capone was a baseball player at one point,
I
from
think
what
that
I understand.
there definitely been some accomplished athletes that have made it into the ranks of organized crime. Some Italian fully made guys, some associates. I mean, just off the top of my head, I know there was a Jewish guy out at New England, Maurice Lerner, that they all called pro because he played at least semi-pro baseball.
Yeah.
In Chicago, there were two guys that I'm thinking of right now that played on the Bears, the Chicago Bears, and it was before the current NFL. So this was back in like the 40s or 50s. But I believe Lou Rosanova, who was a pretty powerful guy, and then a like a enforcer that wasn't Italian named Wayne Bach, I think. And these were guys that had, I mean, they weren't stars in the NFL, but had like a cup of coffee. So yeah. And then Phil Leonetti was a
Basketball player, yeah.
basketball player in high school, started for his high school basketball team. So yeah, one of the best stories I think about it, a nickname that comes from and this is a digression, but a nickname that comes from someone's prowess in sports. There was a hitman for the Gambinos who was a capo out of New Jersey. I can't pronounce his last. I don't want to butcher his last name. It's like Biasia, Robert Biasia, but they called
Bobby
him
Gabbert, yeah.
Bobby. No, they called him Bobby Cabert.
Yeah.
It looks like Cabert. It should have been
Yeah.
spelled with a K. They called him Bobby Cabert because in the 60s and 70s, he was a world-class fast pitch softball pitcher. And he would strike so many people
Shit.
out, they called him Cabert instead of Robert.
Yeah, I've talked about Bobby on this show. He was a hitman at one point, as you alluded to. He was involved with a lot of people. One of the high-ranking members of the Gambino crime family today, one of the first hits he was allegedly involved in was involved Bobby Gabbert. But
let me just say one thing about Joey, though. I think that you made a good point about being born into this life. And I think there are some people, and I'm just going to juxtapose Crazy Phil Leonetti and Joey. If you're going to take Phil at his word, Phil seems to believe that if there was no Nicky Scarfo, if he had not been, groomed by his uncle from a very, very young age, Leonetti believes that he wouldn't have gone into the mafia.
Mm-hmm.
And Leonetti right now, as a man in his 70s, living in the witness protection somewhere, if you believe him, in this part I definitely believe, he is as content can be living anonymously. And let me just tell you, as someone that has spent a great deal of time speaking, meeting, interviewing retired or deposed gangsters, most of them, even if they're removed from the life, whether it be voluntarily or involuntarily, they long for that life. Phil doesn't have any of that in him. Moving over to Joey, I think if we had Joey here and Joey was being, forthright with us, this is what Joey wanted. And this is what Joey would have gravitated to, whether or not his family was in the mob or not. Joey is at the core of his DNA. Joey's a gangster. Joey lives his life as a gangster to this day. Guy's got no means of income. Guy's never had any means of income. He drives a Rolls Royce. He wears, over $100,000 on his wrists and his necks and his fingers. Lives in $1 million house.
And he quickly kind of delved into criminality, right? By 20 years old, getting in fights with people down in Atlantic City. He gets hit with some ag assault charges, but ultimately gets a more serious charge, down the road, if you will. He's involved kind of in the streets, moving around.
He was coming up in the Scarfo regime underneath his dad, and Nicky Scarfo at the time, was his baptismal godfather, as well as being the Don. It was Chucky's best friend. At this point in the early to mid 80s, Chucky and Nicky were best friends. Joey was very close to Nicky Scarfo's son, little Nicky Scarfo. And they were, errand boys guys that would, go get coffee, go get dry cleaning. I know one of the things that Joey and Nicky Jr. did was launder casino money or skim money or just illegal money in general. They take the casino, they take out a bunch of chips, they play for a little bit, and then cash the chips in, go over to Nicky Scarfo, and turn the money in. So they were climbing the ladder together until they weren't. Nicky Scarfo,
and that's what I kind of wanted to talk
yeah,
about. By the mid '80s, there kind of is an issue, right? It's Chucky Merlino, Joey's father, big drinker, alcoholic, if you will. Nicky Scarfo essentially demotes him, right?
I think
And
there was an incident that was like the final straw. Was that Chucky got into it with the Pagans biker gang,
yep,
and took his Mercedes and rammed it into a bunch of the bikers' Harley Davidsons in front of a bar or the clubhouse. It caused, politically within the gangland sphere of Philadelphia, it caused a lot of headaches, and I think it prompted Nicky Scarfo to say, the drinking is making you too erratic. You need to take a seat.
when Nicky Scarfo is saying you're acting too erratic,
I know, right?
you have a bit of a problem. So he kind of is demoted, and then that would lead up to Nicky Scarfo and everybody getting jammed up. Chucky ultimately gets 45 years in federal prison, and he would actually die there. Now,
Yep.
the next in line comes John Stanfa, grabs what's left, right? And the problem with John Stanfa, as you know, is John Stanfa was not born in Philadelphia. Okay. He was a Sicilian guy. Most of these guys are Americanized Italians. They couldn't speak one word of Italian other than like Madone, probably. And they viewed John Stanfa as that old timer, mustache Pete, maybe a little cagey.
Carpetbagger. Yeah. Interloper.
Sure, an interloper. Great way to say it. So, as you have this young brash group coming up who was essentially royalty, you have this old timer. And this was all going to coagulate. Now, before that, though, Joey had some more legal problems. In and around 1987, he and an individual, Richard Carbone, had a connection through a federal armored express car company, like the vans that transport money. This guy they knew called Stephen Rinaldi. Now, they somehow figure out this scheme where Rinaldi drops the bag on the road. They pick it up, and they made off with like $350,000, right? Big score for a young group of kids in their 20s. Ultimately, though, they would get hemmed up on it. And
well, they got hemmed up on it because Joey wouldn't give the other guys their share.
Yes.
Joey kept the whole $300K for himself, and one of those guys went and ratted him.
Yep. So it would lead to kind of his first prison sentence, right? Joey would head up to FCI McKean. He'd get 3 years. Now, during his time, he would meet some.
Can I interject real quick?
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I just want to make sure that we have a proper understanding of what was going on before Joey left. So there was about a 2-year gap between Scarfo and Chucky Merlino and those guys getting swept up in the spring of '87, and Joey going to prison in '89. And in that 2 years, like you said, I just want to color up a little bit. Stanfa is installed, I guess, for lack of a better word, by the Gambinos, by the New York family. This wasn't like the Philadelphia family decided to anoint John Stanfa. He had been a refugee. I mean, he had came to America in the '70s. The Gambinos placed him with the Philadelphia family. I mean, this was like, he wasn't, I mean, even from day one, he wasn't really a part of the Philadelphia.
And when we look back on Stanfa, he had really kind of started as a cagey, manipulated snake who was there the night Bruno got whacked. He's driving a car. He somehow gets lead. It was almost like if you remember when Galante was killed, Baldo Amato and
Cesare
Bonaventure, make out and get away. It was almost like they had kind of agreed beforehand. Hey. Yeah, Bruno's going to get killed. Drive him here, and this is where it's going to happen. And down the road,
The thing that I find most interesting, and I've reported this, I got my hands on some FBI documents from '87, '88. I had always assumed in all my writing up until, let's say, I got a hold of these documents, that the narrative had been Joey goes to prison, links up with Ralph Natale, and they start scheming to take the family from Stanfa. But if you go by what informants were telling the FBI in 87 and 88, Joey, before he even turned 30, Joey and Mikey Chang, Scarfo and Chucky Merlino go to prison in March of 87. By April and May, so within weeks, Joey Merlino and Mikey Chang are going around the city telling everybody that it's a new era, that they're taking over. So, I mean, this was before Joey even got into prison.
I think one thing I learned about what I know about Stanfa is, as you said, no one came out in Philadelphia and said, hey, this is our guy. We all submit to him. He's our boss. It was kind of just like, oh, well, he's kind of like the only one that maybe we think can handle it, so we'll put him in as
well, and the New York family said, this is your new boss.
And the rousing troops below John Stanfa didn't respect him for the most part. Right. And if you remember, I mean, John Stanfa had very few people around him. That was one of the reasons he went to people like John Veazey, who had no connection to the mafia, and just said, hey, we need people, mount up.
And so I think people from Sicily, a bunch of guys that he, in his mind, were going to be loyal soldiers, but in reality, they were fuck ups and they turned out to be informants.
Yeah, and I think we can make it. No one that knows anything here will tell you that I don't think anyone respected John Stanfa, and that was something where it was a couple of years, and in turn, most of the people on the street, most of the people that are actually moving around in the street, knew who the real people were that were making noise, and it was these young guys coming up. Now, this would set off once Merlino gets out of prison. He does this couple of years. He's kind of meeting Natale, kind of plotting his takeover.
Natale was as much as Natale turned out to be a clown, and he did. But Natale was integral because if Joey and those guys don't get Natale, I don't think they're able to gain the support of New York. Even if they're able to remove Stanfa from power, the New York guys would have sent shooters into Philly to get rid of those guys. They needed Ralph Natale to politic for them based on the fact that he was an old Bruno guy, based on the fact that he'd been in prison for 15 years with a lot of the New York guys. So they used Ralph. Ralph used them and they used Ralph. But if it's not for Ralph Natale going to these guys in the five families and saying, hey, these younger guys are with me, I vouch for them, I don't think they would have been as successful as they had been.
And remember, I mean, Joey gets out way before Ralph. Ralph's supposed to do 5-7 years till the late 90s. So Joey goes out back in the street.
Well, I think it was 2 years. He comes out in Joey comes out in 92.
Like mid 90s.
94.
Right.
All of 94.
But until then, Joey, continues to have his friends around him. The Borgheses, the Mazzones, the Scafidis, all these guys.
And they kill a bunch of people.
Right. They're back and forth, and this would set off a war. You're having shootouts on I 76. You're having shootouts at luncheonettes. You're having all sorts of things going on. Bodies are dropping, and this is where, if we did a Veazey show, Veazey is cordoned off as Stanfa's guy to go out and take care of people. Him and Philip Coletti and some of those characters. So their job is to kill Merlino people. Merlino had people doing their work as well. Ultimately, it would set up to 93, August of 93.
But look, can I just go back 1 second and let people know that Stanfa brought Joey and Mikey Chang in, for a period of time. It looked like the war was going to stop because after the first handful of bodies dropped, one of them being Stanfa's number 2 at the time, little Felix Bacchino, Stanfa reaches out and says to Joey and Mikey Chang, all right, let's end this. I'm going to make you guys. I'm going to induct you guys. And I'm going to name Mikey Chang's brother, Joey Chang, as my underboss, thinking that that's going to, stop the conflict. But in reality, Joey Chang and Mikey Chang, even though they were brothers, they didn't like each other. That structure fell apart very, very quickly. And I'm going to lead up to where you were going. Joey Chang, or Mikey Chang, I should say, thinks the whole thing falls apart in later on in 92 when Mikey Chang is coming back from a basketball game. He takes fire from a pair of shooters that are shooting at his house where his kids are, and he claims one of those shooters is his brother.
And that's a kind of another interesting layer to this grouping. Everyone knows everyone. These are three brothers, and remember, their father was a stone cold guy back in
Who's in prison? Who's in prison at
yeah,
this point?
right. He did 50 years on his head. They're all kind of on rival sides. That's kind of the interesting foreshadowing of all this. So this leads up to August of '93. Joey and his people are at Six and Catherine at a clubhouse. They're hanging out, and John Vesey has mentioned he and Philip Coletti are driving around looking for Merlino people. They spot Joey and some of his underlings. And at one point, Vesey sees his brother, Billy Vesey, and essentially says, I can't do this. My brother's there. Like, I don't want to do this. So I'll essentially wait for them to kind of move away a little bit. And that's where they shoot at Ciancaglini and Merlino. Now, Michael is shot and killed, and Merlino gets shot in the ass.
And Mikey dies in Joey's arms.
Yeah.
I mean, it's something out of a movie. Mikey and Joey were best friends.
Mm-hmm.
They decided to take over the family together. Mikey was as ballsy and as ambitious and as charismatic as Joey is. Mikey Chang was, I think, his counterpart. It was equal in his balls, ambition, and magnetism.
And if you ever see them at the funeral, Joey's in a walker. He can barely walk. But that was a very rough day for obviously for him. And this kind of ratcheted everything up. Now, ultimately, for everything that went on here, Stanfield would get jammed up and John Vesey would cooperate against him. And Stanfield would kind of be out of the way then. And then
that paved the way for the Merlino regime,
yep.
which at the time was dubbed the Natale regime. But in reality, now that we're 30 years removed, we really know that Ralph Natale was really just a front boss and was being puppeted, even though he was in the 60s and these guys were in their 30s. Once they used Ralph to get into power, well, they continued to use him as a lightning rod in front of them, but Ralph might have thought that he was calling shots in 94, 95, 96, but in reality, Joey and Georgie and Stevie and those guys, they were really running the streets.
And I do want to talk a little bit about this Coletti, Philip Coletti. Both of these two, Coletti and Vesey, will cooperate. And he would actually say at trial that he had attempted to kill Merlino by using a bomb on his car multiple times, but the bomb didn't detonate. And
Joey Merlino is probably the luckiest human being in the history of organized crime. I don't say that lightly. He is, they talk about people with 9 lives. Joey has 99 lives, whether it be people trying to murder him or the prosecutors trying to put him in jail for the rest of his life. He is incredibly lucky. He's averted, at least a dozen assassination attempts, has beat murder charges at trial. And, what I always go back to, and I think this perfectly encapsulates him, and it's an anecdote that he tells people, he tells me, I have the devil on my shoulder. Yeah, I got the devil looking out for me.
I think what exasperates all of this is his candidness and flamboyance and kind of just taking it on full force. Like, he had a comment at one point, and this was a famous quote by him, where a reporter says to him, "Hey, there's a $500,000 bounty on your head," and he goes, "That's cool. Give me the $500,000 and I'll kill myself." That was his like flamboyance, and it was fascinating. This is a guy who would regularly invite, like a Dave Stratweiser into the Passyunk Avenue club he had. I want to talk about kind of the flamboyance of him kind of out of the streets, like in kind of life in Philadelphia. Around this time, Joey's becoming this prodigal son, right? He's becoming the new kind of head, him and Natale. The city is theirs at this point. And they're dealing and paving plenty of money out of the rackets that are in Philadelphia. Around this time, the Philadelphia Flyers are doing very well also. And in 1996, they had one of the best teams in the NHL. They were top of the Eastern Conference. They ultimately would lose to the Florida Panthers. They were the number 1 seed. It was really a great year. Now, during that season, we started seeing Merlino popping up at Flyers games, hanging out, doing his thing, moving around some of the bars and the clubs. And at one point in the winter of 95 into 96, he's photographed at a Flyers game in seats that belonged to Eric Lindros. Now, this would lead to what the tabloids do. They did this with John Gotti. They do it with Merlino still to this day. When something pops up with Joey, they talk about it. He's a, guy people want to hear about. He would claim after he did an interview on the radio with
Right.
Howard Eskin.
He
big
called
time.
into the sports radio station in Philadelphia.
And it's actually on, you can look this up on Google. It's a really fascinating call. He would essentially kind of call in to talk about how he wanted to kind of leave the rumors out. And people started jumping to speculation that maybe he was making money off information he was getting from Lindros, and that Lindros may be dating one of Merlino's sisters and all this stuff. And Merlino would say that he, essentially just met him at a department store at one point and took a photo with him, and that people were just jumping to conclusions. They make stuff up about him, and that he had bought the tickets from just like a ticket website or a ticket.
This is why, but this is why Joey is Joey, and this is why he's so OG. Back in the 20th century, I'd say from the 20s, probably up into the 70s or 80s, there was a lot of commingling between professional athletes and mob guys. That's kind of stopped in the last 30, 40 years. For obvious reasons, the leagues themselves are policing it because these leagues have become such money makers, and the players themselves are now, in football and basketball, guys are making $40-50 million a year. So they're like investments that these owners are making. They want to make sure that they're protecting those investments. But Joey's one of these guys that's still, and I know from, this is the thing what we're talking about with Lindros is from 95, 96. I know some anecdotal circumstances from the last couple of years where Joey is spending time with current professional athletes, former professional athletes, A-list actors. So that's why he's so old school, that maybe most mob guys don't do that anymore. Joey still does.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, this is still going on with him today. Like he's a bon vivant. I've always kind of said that he's very likable, very charismatic to a lot of people. And there would be people that would start calling into the radio and say, hey, I saw Joey at this place, Labrador's Pub in Queens Village, and it was late at night, and Merlino was there with Lindros, and you start having this stuff pop up. And ultimately, nothing criminal went on, and it was just kind of chalked up as a story. But as you said, this is not something that he just did one time. We're going to get to, really towards the end of the show, a photo that popped up last week.
Yeah.
And it just happened to be a guy that this isn't the first time that he's been photographed.
And I don't think I'm speaking out of school here because this has been public information, but one of the guys that's in Joey's crew right now is the father of an NHL player, and they go to games.
Yeah.
So I don't know what and then Joey's daughter right now is engaged to a member of the Colorado Rockies. So,
and remember also, this is also a guy who within the last 10 years, Joey's had multiple Instagrams, and he posted pictures regularly with people like Rick Tocchet.
Yeah,
another NHL guy
who got caught in
a gambling ring, right?
Right.
We've seen Joey photographed with Meek Mill. We've seen, now again, a lot of, I don't know that, maybe Meek Mill was told who that was, and he kind of looked at it.
I know Meek Mill knew who it was. Meek Mill loves Joey. I think there's another thing that should be a point that's made that I've emphasized in interviews I've done. Joey and his group of friends, being cool is very important. Cool is a currency with the Philadelphia Mafia. 99% of mobsters through history, they couldn't care less about being cool. They wanted to stay out of prison. They didn't want to be cool. But for Joey and his friends, being cool is important. And I think you can date it back to the 80s, in late 70s, when Joey and his friends were a bunch of young mob princes. Wherever they went was the place to be. When they were in high school, wherever they went was the place. Then they become mobsters in the 90s, as you're talking about. Where they're hanging out becomes fodder for the Philadelphia press. It becomes, someone in some instances you would think that businesses would want mobsters to stay away from them. In Philadelphia at that time, if those mobsters were hanging out there, that meant more people were coming through the door.
Absolutely. That's exactly right. And that's something we had not really ever seen. When you look back on all this stuff, 20, 30 years beforehand, you had a boss in Angelo Bruno who they called him the Quiet Dom because he didn't want anyone to know who he was. He just moved in secrecy. Now, Joey, like the other counterparts before him began making connections with other groups in the city, most notably the Pagans Motorcycle Club, Junior Black Mafia.
Black Mafia, yeah.
And what's interesting about the Junior Black Mafia is even today, there are still photos, people like Tracy Mason, who was involved with that group. These guys have still, they still think, yeah.
Benny Goff, who's one of the leaders, Tracy, as you met, Tracy Mason, with the Pagans, Gorilla, who was the big boss man in the 90s, who Joey and them were, in cahoots. Gorilla gets ousted and is out of the picture in jail and then on the shelf. And then in the last 5 years, Gorilla's back on top. Gorilla's been reinstalled as the president of the Philadelphia Pagans. So who knows where that relationship stands right now?
We've also seen a lot of things Joey was doing to really kind of make himself known in the community, like nice things he was doing. He was regularly throwing these ostentatious parties for poor kids.
Yeah. That was his Capone era.
He was fighting about turkeys on Thanksgiving. Give Christmas presents for little kids from Kensington on Christmas. And there's a great, I know you've seen this. It's an audio clip from way back then in the 90s. And they're at the party and Joey's standing around talking to Joe Legambi's in the video. Fat Angelo Lutz played Santa. And there's this kid that walks up to Joey and they grab the audio and he goes, "Thank you, Joey. You're my idol." And it's just a really fascinating clip because, this is not a
basketball player or a movie star.
This isn't the mayor of Philadelphia. Like, this is a guy who the federal government says is a person who survived multiple assassination attempts due to taking over violently the Philadelphia Mafia. And it's
according to the FBI, he's responsible for a dozen murders.
And remember, Scott, this is also a guy who made it. And this is why, like, when I talk about this stuff, and I think when you talk about this stuff, these are people that have flaunted this stuff in the media, and they have no problem talking about it with the media, right? It's just part of history, and it's out there, and it's meant to be told. Now,
and I think, but to that point, I also think that you have a situation with the federal government and the Merlino organization that is unique. Because in all these other cities, you have a very business-like relationship where you have the government doing their job and the mobsters doing their job, and they both kind of recognize it. And it's kind of like cops and robbers, cowboys and Indians. There's not that personal animus. But with what's going on in Philadelphia to this day, you have 30 years of animosity and bitterness on the part of the government.
Yeah.
So it becomes much more personal, and you jam the guy up in a situation like you did, a couple years ago, where he ends up having to go to prison for placing a bet. I know that they wanted to make more of it, but at the end of the day, he placed a bet over the phone, and he had to go
set up. And this was set up because of years of putting himself out there, making himself the John Gotti of Passyunk Avenue, where he's out there, he's kind of thumbing his nose up, and eventually, the federal government's going to work to you and get to you. Now, I want to talk about one of the holdovers from the Stanfa group. This individual, this big character called Ron Previty. Now, Previty, we've done a show on. He was this cop who ultimately got into criminality, got connected to the mafia in the Stanfa years, into the Natali years, and into the Merlino years. And
one of Joey's biggest miscalculations.
Yes, absolutely. He's someone that was an earner. He was making money. Now, little did the mob know, he was secretly had a relationship with not only the FBI, but the state police and the people in New Jersey. And he was wired for sound. Now, during this time, Ron Previty is becoming a big moneymaker. And the holdover that, for whatever reason, just was the one guy that didn't get arrested during the Stanfa group, he kind of slots right into the crew with Joey. Now, history will tell us that Joey tried to not say much around Ron Previty because he would claim that he didn't trust him necessarily. Now, Ron Previty was still making a lot of money. It was alleged that Previty was not only involved with illicit business, but legitimate business. He was doing prostitution. He had bookmaking, loans. He even had a very profitable P2P business where he was moving P2P to make methamphetamine. He's, and you look at kind of the money of drugs, Scott. you're getting P2P. Raymond Martirano did this many years ago. You're getting P2P for $200 a gallon or something in Europe. You're selling it here for $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, $6,000. The profit margin is huge. Now, Previty would tell an interesting story, according to him, that at one point Merlino would run up over $200,000 in bookmaking bets, and Previty said he never got the money.
He's a guzzler. I mean, again, I don't think Joey, if he's sitting there with you, I don't think he would deny it.
No.
Yeah, I pay. I collect when I win, and I don't pay when I lose.
A lot of people do that.
Right.
A lot of people do that.
And he uses beards or fronts, people to bet into bookmakers without realizing that those bets are not the person that's making the bet. The bet's actually coming from Joey. And one thing Joey will for sure tell you is that he's a degenerate gambler. He has no problem telling people that. I mean, bets on everything.
And I think the goal of the FBI by this point is they realized, and the people that were speaking to Previty on a regular basis is saying, this is the guy. We want this guy. You got to connect him. Because by this point, Previty is starting to get into the drug trade. He's aligning with people up in Boston. He's trying to get Joey to speak about this. The problem is he really can't connect Joey to anything. Joey's smart. That's one thing about Joey Merlino that no one talks about his cunningness, his intelligence. He's not going to say anything that's going to get him in trouble. And Previty was challenged in this. He had issues getting him to speak about things.
And I think that flies in the face of the narrative. I think that's a very good point, Jeff, because it flies in the face of the narrative of him being this reckless mob don. He might, I mean, there's certain behavior traits that could be perceived as reckless, and that would be accurate. But to your point, he's never been caught in a wire talking about a murder. He's, the wires that people have had on him, not a lot has come from those. Previty probably made 100 tapes about the guy, and all I think the best you had was them talking about cocaine and Joey pointing to his nose, but that wasn't enough to get a conviction.
We can say what we want about his flamboyance and stuff, but the truth of the matter is, I think this what makes him one of the most interesting people over the last 20 years in this world, and someone that you just have to mention and talk about. At one point, Previty claimed that Merlino said to him, quote, "It don't bother me, no one. Every day I get blamed for something in this. If the feds have a case, they should bring it. If not, then leave me the fuck alone." And I think he's always made it very well known. If you got the goods, bring it. I'll not only fight it, but I'll even beat you on certain things. You don't have nothing on me. Leave me alone.
Nobody in his inner circle is ever going to flip on him. And as long as that, that truism stays, those are the guys that he trusted in these murders that could put him away for the rest of his life. And it's been 30 years. Everyone's kept their mouth shut. Some of these guys have gotten really jammed up. Joey's former driver and bodyguard is doing 50 years in prison right now on a murder. Has a get out of jail free card. Didn't use it. Dom Grandi, the up and coming superstar that's kind of being groomed to take over for Joey. He's just went into prison for the first time in his life. He's about to do 7 years. Could have got out of it. All these guys keep their mouth shut.
They're all friends. They're all very loyal to each other. Now, the one person that was starting to have some concerns with Previty was some of the dealings that Natalie was having. And this again proves the smartness of Merlino, right? He kind of installs that Natalie's the one pulling the strings, not me. He's the setting the prices. And at one point, Previty essentially says that he had gotten people to say on tape that the old man was the one setting the prices for all this stuff, whether it's cocaine or whatever. And he's continuously trying to get Merlino to also say this. And as you said, it wasn't happening. Now, I do want to talk about a more human side of Merlino that Previty talked about.
Yeah, I'm sure it's a good anecdote. Yeah,
I'm sure you know this story. He would kind of talk about at one point in the summer of one of these years during like the heyday of the 90s. Ron Previty was invited to a party at one of Joey's homes in Margate down at the shore. And Ron lived in the area. He lived in South Jersey. And he had said that he couldn't attend because his girlfriend's son she had some
mentally challenged somehow.
Yeah, he was autistic. He wasn't good around people. And Joey essentially says, well, bring him. He'll be fine. We got a pool. Everything will be good. And Ron talked about when the kid went to the pool and he got to the thing, he constantly started making
like gun noises.
Yeah, and like saying he's a criminal. That guy's a gangster.
Right.
And he said Joey just laughed it off and really tried to make the kid feel at home. Like, he knew that the kid didn't, make a lot of friends, and he tried to be nice to the kid and try to show like a human
There's a
side.
reason people like the guy. He's a
Yeah.
likable guy. I mean, he is.
He very much is. Yeah.
And that bodes well in his favor in what he's trying to do. He has a natural leadership quality to him. People rally behind him. They're loyal to him. I think that the difference, if you want to make another juxtaposition between Joey and Ralph, Joey is a lot of things. Joey is someone that I think can play a lot of roles, wear a lot of hats. He's very diversified, even in his personal life and in his business life. Ralph, at the end of the day, Ralph was one thing and one thing only. Ralph was a drug dealer. And that's the only way Ralph knew how to make money. He didn't really know how to lead men, even though he wanted to pretend like he was a leader of men. He didn't really know how to get his hooks into politicians or into legitimate business. He knew how to deal drugs. And Joey and them, to kind of what you said, Joey and them kind of realized that was what Ralph was. I don't know if at first, I think they wanted him to be more, but they realized that's all he was.
Well, they weren't going to complain about where the money was coming from.
Right.
They were just going to pretend they didn't hear about where the money
They were annoyed
Right.
because Ralph would hold these organization events where he would get up in front of them like he was a football coach, and he'd give them these pep talks about all the stuff they were going to do and all of the legitimate businesses they were going to infiltrate, all the unions they were going to take over, all of the politicians they were going to have in their pocket. And he would get these young guys all jacked up, and very quickly, none of it came to fruition. And Ralph just really wanted to act like Joey, but not actually do.
Well, it's almost like Ralph Natale his whole life just wanted to be the guy, and he finally got his opportunity to be the guy, and in turn was being used by everyone else.
He was a false prophet. I think
Absolutely.
If he was someone who could have done what he said he could have done, those guys could have, stayed behind him.
Absolutely. Now, at one point, to kind of go off of what you're saying, Merlino would make a comment to Previty in some of this drug talk. Merlino would respond just essentially, hey, be careful up there. That's a bad pinch. Right? So he understands, like, hey, I don't want to be involved with that.
The drug dealing is happening in Boston. They had met a guy. Natale had been hooked up with a guy from Boston who was his family had been a part of the Cadillac Frank Salemi regime. Cadillac Frank had been sent to prison. This guy was kind of looking he couldn't get made in Boston.
Well, we'll just say who it is.
Bobby Luisi.
Yeah.
So Bobby Luisi ends up hooking up through someone that he knew that also knew Ralph Natale. They end up meeting up, and Ralph Natale introduces Bobby Luisi then to the younger guys in Philly, and they put him in Previty and Georgie Borghese and Joey Merlino, and they give him his own crew up in New England and Boston, and they were moving a lot of blow.
And I think by this point, the writing was on the wall. Joey Merlino probably said to himself, you know what? If I get jammed up for extortion or bookmaking, I really don't care about that pinch. That's 10 years.
Right.
Because as long as I don't have no murders or drug dealing, I'm going to be all right. And I think today, it's still probably that thought. They don't care about doing 5 years. Not a lot of these guys care. Now, obviously, they're away from their family, which sucks. But it's, as long as there's nothing crazy. In fact, we'll get to what Merlino says when he ultimately does get arrested.
I think there's a mandate right now from the federal government after the last case that Joey took in 2016, where they weren't really able to get anything other than that one small gambling charge where we had to go to prison for like 10 months. I've been told there's some type of edict that's been sent down from Washington that's telling the Philadelphia prosecutors and FBI office, you're not bringing any more cases.
Stop with the popcorn shit. Right.
Unless it's murder or drugs.
Right. Because again, it's just popcorn nonsense headlines. Yeah. You're not really making any moves doing this. It's a waste of money. Time. Right. Absolutely. And you could use this money, the same money you're using on watching 80-year-old gangsters, take it up and solve some of the problems you have in other parts of the city or other areas of the region.
All it does is empower Joey.
Right.
I mean, and it builds the urban myth up even, adds fuel to the flames of who this guy is. So it's like, in some ways, he's He's a product of what the government has made him out to be.
But by 1999, they felt like they had enough. Okay, and they arrest Joey Merlino. They arrest him down in Margate. It's kind of
On
a
a drug
theatrical.
case.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. It was kind of a theatrical arrest as well. Certain people were involved, and it was, in the morning down the shore. And listen, I think
He
it's
allegedly
important.
made a threat in
Right.
the car to one of the
FBI
agents
guy.
that were arresting him.
But I want to kind of set the stage as to how like crazy this is. Okay. So I don't know if you've ever been to the Jersey Shore, but on June,
10 years ago. I haven't been
on
there.
June 28th, that's prime. That's right before July 4th. And every home down there is right on top of the next. It's just like Philadelphia. It's South Philly with sand. That's what I always say. And to go in on a summer day, I mean, that's crazy. That's really just, we're going to make a statement here. We want to walk you out, right?
Mm-hmm.
This isn't like, hey, we're going to see you and we're just going to pick you up and take you away. No, they wanted to make a statement. They did it. And they felt like they had enough. They get him for drugs. They had a couple of murders attached to this. They felt like they had enough to put him away.
They had I'm not trying to be get in the weeds here, but I just want people to understand. The 99 case was the drug case.
Yep.
The 2000 case
expanded
was the racketeering murder case. Right. The guys that got taken down in that 2000 case, which was his whole crew, were not in the 99 case.
Right. It was in a roundabout way, a superseding kind of,
for all intents and purposes, it was a superseding, but in reality, it was a separate case.
They wanted to get him off the street and said, we'll put it together, but we hold them. We'll put it together and we'll supersede it. And that's what they did. There were two separate cases.
They knew the Mazzones and the Borgheses knew that in summer of 99 when they picked up Joe, or summer of 99 when they picked up Joey, they knew that they were on borrowed time and that a case was going to be coming against them in the next year. And it came in the next, I think, 10 months later.
Now, what's interesting, and we'll talk about what ultimately would happen with Joey Merlino in a second, but this would ultimately create, as we know, a power vacuum because Joey's off the street. So there's a new group or a new person coming in. And a lot of people believed it was going to finally be Joe Legambi, right? The big guy, the older guy. He'd been around since the 70s. And I've said before, is one of the most effective people this city has had.
One of the most underrated organized crime figures, in my opinion, in history.
Agreed.
And he came from nowhere. He's one of these guys that was like, if you want to make the equivalent to like an NFL or NBA draft choice, he was like, like a Steph Curry, right? Like, or a guy that wasn't thought.
He was Tom Brady,
right? Wasn't thought to be a superstar, but turned out to be a superstar.
And again, like this is a guy who was charged with murder and got life.
Right.
He got
it
pulled off from a technicality, and I want to kind of bring up the North Jersey faction of the Philly mob because there's a North Jersey faction in Newark. According to a guy, Pete Caprio, Pete the Crumb, he claims that he had set up possibly an assassination to kill Legambi, Borghese, and Steve Mazzone.
And this was all another thing. This is a piece of lost history. And again, I've written about it, but it hasn't gotten a ton of publicity. The fact that there was a murder attempt on Mazzone, Borghese, and Legambi has gotten a lot of media attention. But the part that I've added hasn't. And that part is that Ralph Natale, after he had cut his deal with the government in the fall of 99, was plotting with Pete the Crumb Caprio from a witness protection unit to kill Legambi, Mazzone, and Borghese.
And they felt like Merlino was gone.
But think about how ballsy that is.
Yeah.
You make a deal with the government. You're going to give everybody up. You're going into witness protection, but you're still on the phone with your guys in New Jersey trying to arrange the assassination of your predecessor.
One thing we can say about Ralph Natale, word to describe him, snake, surely.
And none of it worked. He thought he was the smartest guy in the room.
And he never was.
Yeah, he was making all these moves. And none of them worked out. They all blew up in his face.
He became just a babbling idiot.
And at the end of the day, I think this to me is the ultimate just desserts. So he becomes the first city mafia don to ever cooperate. They make a big deal about that, right? We'll talk about the trial in a second. But Ralph Natale ended up doing more time than any of the people that he testified against.
Yeah, in the end, he, as I said, just kind of became just a laughable idiot. Like,
The whole
really.
point of cooperating is that you do less time than the people you're cooperating
He was
against.
just a dumb guy. I mean, just that's what
He does 15 years, and Joey and those guys, all do between 6 and 12.
Right. Now, on July 20th, 2001, there would be a mixed verdict in the Merlino stuff. He, in the most serious charges involving the murders, attempted murders, he got off. He beat the rap on those. However, though, he did get found guilty of racketeering, extortion, bookmaking, all that stuff.
But this is also points to why he's so smart, Jeff.
Yes, it is.
Ralph is getting up on the stand and testifying in these murder counts to what he was told by Joey and Stevie and Georgie. Joey, Stevie, and Georgie knew when they were telling him this stuff back in 96, 97, 98, it was all BS. They were feeding him bullshit. So when he got up on the stand, he starts talking about things that aren't true.
It worked perfectly.
Yeah.
And yeah, again, in December of 2001, Herbert Hutton would give Joey Merlino 14 years. And he made a great comment. And this goes back to the whole, as long as it's not murder and I get life, he says, 14 years ain't bad, better than the death penalty. So he kind of laughed at this. Now, there would be one other thing that Merlino would have to deal with. He would be indicted about a month after the verdict in federal court again for the murder of a person called Joe the Nodder Sitdown. Now, Sitdown was part of the New Jersey faction. He would then, though, get acquitted. There was no proof.
There was another hit that Ralph ordered,
Yep.
or Ralph thought that he ordered, and had trusted these younger guys to pull it off, and then had trusted that these younger guys were going to come tell him exactly what they did. Well, the younger guys went and allegedly pulled it off. The Sitdown hit was done by a couple of Caprio's, or one of Caprio's underlings, like a sexual predator, Philly Faye Casali. But all those other hits, allegedly, Joe and his crew are carrying them out, and when they're coming back to Ralph to tell them what happened, they're intentionally muddying the details. If they went right on a street, they told Ralph they went left. If they killed the guy with a gun, they told Ralph they killed the guy with a knife.
So Joey would, beat that, and he would go do his 14 years. He would head off to federal prison, and in March of 2011, be released to a halfway house. And that subsequently, after the time he did, he would move to Boca Raton, Florida, where he still lives today. Now, in a 2013 interview with your friend, George Anastasia, Merlino denied any current involvement in the mafia, stating, quote, "My criminal life is over and that I want no part of that. There are too many rats." Now, remember, in the case that he did 14 years for, some of the testimony came from Ralph Natale, Ron Previty. He was a guy that, made no bones. He said, this is business. This is my life. He made a lot of money as an informant. He
paid him over $1 million.
Yeah, absolutely. And, interestingly enough about Ron Previty would live his life very openly in South Jersey until his death several years ago. He made no bones about what he did. I look back and I remember hearing a quote by one of the people, the wives of these people. And I think she made a comment at one time and said, he is the only one, in talking about Previty, that's on the street, he got out of it. Maybe he was the smart one in the end. Now, Merlino would have some things that he was involved in. He at one point opened a restaurant. He was involved with the opening of a restaurant called Merlino's Supper Club in Boca. Now, I think a lot of people thought this might be the next big thing in Boca. Joey was moving around. He, as usual, was the bon vivant of Boca. He was hanging out at the Boca Raton Hotel and clubs, and he loves to golf, from what I know. And as you know, Joey is, to me, probably, and I'm sure this is what people would say about John Gotti, he was a very likable, regal character. When you see him driving around in the car, or walking into, we'd see him at Memories of Margate. Like, he looked the part. People want to be around him, and he's a likable, fun dude, from what I understand. So
He
likes
broads, beers, betting, cigars, steak dinner.
He's a man. He's a regular man. Yeah. And now, again, they wouldn't stop the government from continuing to watch Joey Merlino
and send guys at him.
Absolutely. In 2016, Merlino was one of the 46 people arrested in an East Coast RICO indictment. Now, essentially, they would say that he was connected with the Genovese crime family, most notably Patsy Perello, a capo up in the Bronx, Rooster D'Onofrio, another high-ranking member. And there was several schemes, one of which was allegedly involving a compound cream medical scam.
Yeah. We're talking about markups. They were making this thing for like 60 cents and selling it for like $600.
Now, Joey, again, in typical Joey fashion, refused, no plea. I'm going to trial on this. I'm going to beat this thing. He would be charged with 1 count of racketeering, 1 count of fraud, and then 2 counts of illegal gambling. Now,
and they had this kid, J.R. Rubio.
John Rubio,
J.R. Rubio, who was at one point had come up under Patsy Perello and as a teenager as like an errand boy. Had kind of graduated to a low-level Genovese associate who got caught up in a case, was cooperating, and the government said, now that Joey's doing business with Patsy, wouldn't it be a great idea to get JR, down with Joey on a regular basis? And however that happened, whether it was Patsy sending JR or JR going on his own, there was a period of time, I think 2012, 13, 14, where this J.R. Rubio was with Joey quite a bit and was taping him. Nothing of, there was no real there in those tapes. And then to speak to how likable he is, J.R. Rubio would get in trouble for not turning over some of the tapes or erasing some of the tapes because he felt bad that he was turning against a guy that he liked so much.
Absolutely. Now, a week after he gets arrested, Joey, in this, he is released on $5 million bail. Who put that up? We have no idea, but he's released. Now, all 45 people involved in this case accepted a plea agreement of some sort. The only one that did not was Joey Merlino. Now, this would work perfectly. Now, remember, when you go up against the federal government, you generally have a 96% chance of losing.
Yeah.
You have a 4% chance of winning, maybe even lower than that.
You help your odds when you're Joey when you bring with you Eddie Jacobs.
And
who's
Joey
one of the
knew
greatest in courtroom litigators, probably,
he's one of the best lawyers ever.
Yeah.
Right. Absolutely. Joey beats the rap again. Okay. Beats the rap. They don't have anything on him. This is a weak case, another long list of weak cases against Merlino. Now, he would enter a plea on April 27th of 2018.
Was it a hung jury or was it
a mistrial? Yeah.
Mistrial. Okay.
Yeah. He would accept a plea on 1 count of transactions involving gambling, which I want to have people understand what that means. Okay. Now, keep in mind, there are not hundreds, but there are a lot of opportunities for people in legalized gambling states to bet on sports. That's essentially what he was arrested for. Something that is similar to speeding or, everyone does it.
Making a bet on a phone. That's what it was. Making a bet on a cell phone.
Yep, absolutely. And he wanted to avoid a retrial. So he pleads guilty to 1 count of facilitating illegal gambling transactions. And there was a prison sentence recommended of about a year. On October 17th of 2018, Joey Merlino would be sentenced to 2 years in prison. Now, he would ultimately be released in October 2019 and is now a free man. He is moving around. I do want to bring up one thing before we get into this infamous photo that came out. About a year ago, an individual in New York called Peter Tuccio was given 10 years in federal prison for arson. Now, this comes back from a ordered arson by someone in the Gambino family that Peter Tuccio committed on a car in Queens. Now, the 2 other people that Tuccio was involved with got probation. They didn't get anything. Tuccio gets hemmed up and jammed up for 10 years. Now, we would find out what a lot of that had to do with.
He's a kid, too. I mean, he's a kid.
Young kid. He's in his young mid-20s. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we would wonder, what the hell happened here? Because if you know anything about arson, that's at maybe 3-4 years in federal prison. They almost tripled him.
Because they want to use him as a gateway to Joey.
And we would find out that this character pops up, Joey, at his trial. This kind of cumbersome cat wearing a tracksuit. Nobody knew who he was. He wasn't one
he's
of
like
the
24 years old, I think.
Yeah, and we would start seeing photos pop up of Peter Tuccio at different people's homes, hanging out with Merlino. And we would find out as well, Tuccio was a bit of a lunatic in Howard Beach. He was doing a lot of dumb things. He was getting involved with the Bonanno crime family.
Yeah, but I will say about this kid, though, it's very interesting. At a very young age, this kid had somehow made inroads in 3 separate crime families.
Well, remember, I think this is important. Peter Tuccio's uncle is Joe Cafe.
Joe Cafe DeCina, who's a capo in the Lucchese's.
But he was picking fights with Ronnie G from the Bonanno family. He had people, he knew people everywhere. He knew John Panisse, he knew all these people. Gene
and he idolized Joey, and he reaches out to Joey on Instagram.
Right. Correct. He just DMs him and kind of starts hanging out. Now, like I said, Tuccio got 10 years. He's doing his sentence. And I think one of the reasons he got 10 years is they were probably trying to lean on him. Yeah. Hopefully, hey, what do you know about this guy?
He was on house arrest for 3 years before they sentenced him.
And we'll give Tuccio, I think, some ethical credit, at least in that world. He didn't say anything. And to this day, he hasn't said anything. Who knows? Maybe he will. Maybe he won't.
Him and Pete Tuccio and Dom Grande are, in some ways, the future of what's happening in Philadelphia. These are 2 kids. Well, one's really a kid and one's in his 40s. And in the world of leadership in the mob, being in your 40s is pretty young. But I think that, Pete's going to go in and do probably 8. Dom's going to do 6 or 7. And it's going to be easy time. And they're going to come out, with a lot of stature. And I don't think, if you ask them again, I don't think this doesn't bother them. I mean, obviously they'd rather be home with their families, but this is the price you have to pay for ascension in organized crime. And I think both these guys went to prison, with the wind at their back. They wanted to go in, get their sentence done, come out and be a.
I did want to ask you, according to the Gangster Report, you put out an exclusive about 2 weeks ago that you have credible information that Tuccio has already become a made man.
Well, I have credible information that Tuccio is either has become a made man or has been told that when he comes out, he will be a made man. I can't get direct confirmation on that, but I have confirmation of the meeting that took place in Long Island in 2021, where I don't think Tuccio wasn't there. Merlino and some of his guys and Joe Cafe and some other Lucchese guys were there, and that they made some type of deal to transfer.
Well, I think the truth is
the Philadelphia guys.
I'm sure the people in New York are happy to get rid of Tuccio from what we know. That he's a bit of an asshole, a bit of a dumb kid.
But the Philadelphia guys seem to really like him. I mean, besides Joey. He's popping up in photos with a lot of those guys.
Right.
It was coming up to Philly. And
what do we know about young 20-somethings? Eventually, they grow up to become 30-somethings, and they get a lot of smarts. I wasn't the same kid I was when I was 25. When he gets out of prison, he is going to be someone who, look, let's just be real. He's in Loretto, okay? You can look up who's in Loretto, too. He's
with Stevie.
Yeah, and he's not just on his own, right? Anyone that knows about the federal prison system understands the pod system, and it's a group. Okay, if you're part of the Mexican mafia, you hang out with people in the Mexican mafia. If you're part of the Italian group, you hang out with. If you have an Italian last name, I heard Seth Ferranti tell a story about this.
Yeah,
Seth Ferranti had an Italian last name. He said people from the mafia came up.
We're coming up to him, being like, "You got to come over here."
We interviewed a guy called Robert Rosso. Now, Robert Rosso is someone who had an Italian name, said they came up to him. Who are you? Where are you from? What are your connections? That's just what they do. Tuccio is going to become a more hardened character.
And he's going to have more connections, and he's going to get more respect. It's just, you got to look at this in a vacuum. You can't look at guys like Dom Grande and Pete Tuccio going away in the same way as regular Joe civilian being sent away to prison. Because that would be the worst thing in the world for a Joe civilian. But for someone like Tuccio and Grande, it's actually a good thing.
State prison is so much different than federal prison, where these folks are. These are places where It's not incredibly difficult time. A medium is FCI. That FCI Loretto, that's a medium. It's not incredibly tough. You're going to be able to move around and hang out with people you want to hang out with. Now, I do want to talk about Joey Merlino. We'll get back to kind of wrapping this thing up. To this day, Joey Merlino is a free man. From what I know, from what you've gathered, there is very little connection he has really to anything illegal, as far as
I
what
would
I
say,
know.
I still believe that what the FBI says, that Joey's still the boss of the Philadelphia
Yeah.
Mafia.
I've been on record as saying I don't.
Do I
I
think
think
that Joey is? Go ahead. Go
real
ahead.
quick. I just want to say I think he's a guy that has realized he spent a lot of his adult life in prison. He has kids. He has a wife. Now I know that the virtual thought that you'll have is, well, then how does he make money? That's a good question. I don't know. I don't pretend to know. I know from what I've heard, he's just hangs out, golfs, does this, does that. This is common knowledge. There's been talk that he's looked to maybe get into some sort of a media, tell some stories, maybe hang out and chat about football or something. I know you feel differently, and who are we to not say, I mean, you speak to people in the law enforcement, it's interesting though.
But I mean, what my opinion though has like a caveat. Yes, I do believe that Joey, by name, by position, is the boss of the Philadelphia mob. I do not believe that Joey has a ton of oversight on a day-to-day basis about what's going on in organized crime in Philadelphia, New Jersey, like he did in the past. I think Joey has been smart enough to learn about how to insulate yourself, how to use buffers, and I don't think he wants to know what's going on. Don't tell me.
Right.
Just bring me an envelope. And that's what I think that that's where he is right now. He doesn't want to know. He trusts guys like Mikey Lance.
Well, Scott,
to run the street, and I don't think he wants to know. I think he just takes an envelope.
Here's something that I'll say to my friends, if you're out there, if you want to come over and hand me an envelope full of money, I'll take it. I won't ask any questions. Here's one thing we will say. Joey Merlino, we wish you the best. We hope whatever goes on. Yeah, look, like I said, I think he's a fascinating character, fascinating guy.
I'm almost embarrassed to say that as a reporter, I kind of root for the guy.
Yeah, I find him to be kind of interesting,
But I also am not going to shortchange my reporting. I'm going to tell it like it is, and I think I have in my time reporting on him. But he's definitely he's a unicorn. I mean, he's someone that I don't think fits into any box that you have here. When we're talking about organized crime in the 21st century, or even in the 20th century, he was his own man, and I'm shocked in some ways that he doesn't have more of a national profile within the East Coast, within New Jersey, Philadelphia, New York. He is as big as you get. I mean, he goes to New York City just to go have dinner, and he ends up on the front page of the New York Post. But outside that area, he hasn't really had legs in terms of his reputation, and I find that surprising. I think if he was in New York City and doing everything that he did in Philadelphia over the last 30 years, he had done it in Brooklyn, I feel like everybody in America would know who he was.
I will say, I think, we're really short on mafia stories that are left to tell. A film about the Merlino group would
hasn't
do very well. I've always said, I think in the younger years, Michael Imperioli would have played a terrific Joey. Now, I do want to say quickly, there has been some recent news involving Joe Merlino on another level. We mentioned some of his penchant for hanging out with celebrities, and whether it be them knowing or not, he always gets a picture with them. This photo popped up recently, and obviously, as we know, that's the former president Donald J. Trump with Joey Merlino. They look very happy, nice smile.
He's pretty unabashed about his love of Donald Trump.
Yes,
he's never really hit it, and that's also why it was so funny back a couple of years ago when some crazy right-wing media outlet tried to break a story saying that Joey was helping Biden stuff ballot boxes. I'm guessing in their mind they thought because of the Delaware was close to Philadelphia, not realizing
Yeah, they didn't do enough research there.
Yeah, and just like anybody that knows anything about Joey knows that he is a huge Trump guy.
He's made no bones about it.
And he said to people, if I was going to stuff ballots for anybody, I wouldn't be stuffing ballots for that guy. I'd be stuffing ballots for Trump.
Now, I will say, at least to me, I don't believe Donald Trump knows who Joey Merlino is. Maybe he does now.
No, I heard from someone that I trust that picture was taken and Donald Trump didn't know who he was taking a picture with.
I think from what I understand, it was an event at the country club, and Joey just happened to be there amongst 300 or 400 other people. They probably walked people in and out. He walked in with a friend of his. They took a picture. Now, I think he knows now, and we all know this is theatrics in government and politics. If this were Joe Biden and he took a photo with, I don't know, some member of the Colombo family, it would also be a story, and Fox News would be running it. This is easy reporting. You have Jake Tapper, people like that who take these stories and run with it and say, well, we knew he was involved with the mob. Look, the truth is, one of the dumbest things I've heard by anyone in news is when they try to paint, look, whether I like Donald Trump or not, I find him to be an interesting character. But the truth is, these people that say he was in the mob because he did building with them back in the 80s, everybody did.
Yeah, anybody that was in the construction, development, contracting, or building world in New York City from the 20s until the 90s, I mean, even till today, really.
Right.
You have to do business with these guys.
I mean, there was a recent bust involving Frank Camuso up in Staten Island, Gambino crime family. He was involved with construction. This is something that was just part of business. We also know Donald Trump was very involved with Atlantic City and building a casino. The mob ran Atlantic City. This was not, you weren't going to not deal with Tony Salerno. Now, I don't think Donald Trump sat down at the table with Fat Tony at Palmo Boy Social Club and chalked up who was getting the insulation drywall money and the painting.
I did hear though, take this with a grain of salt. I heard this from someone that is not a source of mine that I use a lot, but he's given me some decent information over the years. I did hear that when Trump bought Salvi Testa's La Bistro,
they fleeced the mafia.
But there was some type of meeting between Salvi and Trump.
I'm not doubting that. And from what I've heard, Salvi got fleeced. He could have got way more for it. And, Donald Trump, we could say what you want about his business acumen. He fleeced them on that and probably could have got way more.
I'm involved in a project right now. Jeff knows this. I've been involved in it for quite a while. Hopefully it will see the day of light soon. But in Detroit, we have an Iraqi mafia, an Iraqi mob. And these guys are, as serious as cancer. Don't think turbans, beards, and Qurans. Mm-hmm. These guys are as Americanized. These guys are basically Italians that happen to come from Baghdad. They don't pray to Allah. They pray to Jesus. They're Catholic Iraqis. Anyway, part of our story dovetails with Donald Trump in the 1980s in Atlantic City, where Trump, for a short period of time in 1984, was interested in buying the Powerhouse Gym, which is a Detroit brand, which was started by some Iraqi Christians. It's got like 350 outlets around the world now. Back then, I think it had maybe 100, 150. And Trump was wanting to turn Powerhouse Gym into Trump Gym. It was back when he was putting his name on a bunch of different kinds of brands. Yeah. And according to these Iraqi Christians that are criminals that I'm doing business with now and trying to do a docuseries, there was meetings in person with Donald Trump, and that there was a famous night in 1984 at the craps table in one of Trump's casinos where there was $2 million on the table.
I'm not doubting it. I think, again, in this picture, do I think he knew who that was? No. I do not. I think it was just.
Do I think Donald Trump's a mobster or a mob associate? No. That's not.
Now, let me ask you, do you think there could be a job in the cards for maybe you or me where we could just kind of say, hey, you shouldn't take a picture with that guy? It might be good.
Who's ever vetting his guests? I mean,
they probably need to find
some new people to do that. To your point, though, again, with that particular, it probably was one of those scenarios where, hey, you want a photo op with the former president, line up here and, give us $50 or whatever it is. But I don't believe that he knew, but I do believe that he probably should have known.
Now, I'll ask you, Scott, as we wrap this up, we're about a month and a half away from the 61st birthday of Joey Merlino. He, for a lot of his 30s, 40s, 50s, let's just say 15, 16 years has been in prison.
Mhm.
He's had a lot of good years on, outside. I know he was from what I understand, I was at the Eagles game yesterday. He
Yeah,
was
I
at the
heard that.
funeral for Jerry Blavitt, who may rest in peace. Joey lives a pretty fun life from what it looks like. I guess I'll ask you a simple yes or no question, then you can elaborate. Does Joey Merlino, whenever he dies, is it in his own bed or is he in federal prison? What do you
I,
think?
I think he dies in his own bed, a free man.
Agreed.
The government is hell-bent on making another case. I know that there are 7 murders, cold case murders dating back to the late 90s that they want to try to jam him up on, going from 96 up to 2012. I, I I just don't see them making those cases. If those cases were going to be made, they would have been made already. I wrote something recently about the FBI viewing this kind of Hail Mary scenario where they could dig up a body of a former Merlino associate named Dutchy Avicoli, where you wouldn't necessarily need an eyewitness. You could potentially, if you dug the body up, you could match DNA from the body or from what's around the body to either one of Joey or one of Joey's guys that did it. It seems like a real long shot. I think that's why they're calling it, a Hail Mary effort. I've heard there's been a couple, not digs, but surveys of land in New Jersey over the last couple of years. I know that, or where they believe Dutchy is buried. I know that Ralph Natale, at the end of his life, even though his cooperation in court had been completed, he had got out of prison, I think, in 2014 or 15. But at the end of his life, the FBI was going to meet with Ralph. I don't want to say on a regular basis, but on a semi-regular basis, and they were trying to find information to locate Dutchy.
The problem with Ralph Natale is he is not.
He has no credibility.
Yeah, it's not credible at all.
So, but they've had other people tell them that Dutchy's buried somewhere in North Jersey. That I really see that's the only opportunity for them to make a case. And even if they found Dutchy, that doesn't guarantee they're going to make a case. I don't see anybody flipping. And like I said before, I don't think the Philadelphia U.S. Attorney's Office is going to bring a case unless they can bring a murder charge.
Agreed.
And I just don't see them bringing murder charges.
Yeah, I think they're essentially, down the road, we'll be done with covering this stuff and looking into them. They're not going to have these units that care much anymore. They're a bigger fish to fry and other criminal elements.
And there hasn't been a hit in 10 years plus. And I just don't think they're not going to do that anymore.
Absolutely.
I don't think they're going to hit guys anymore. So if you're not hitting guys,
a fascinating life, a fascinating career, and a guy that, I'm sure we'll still hear info about. Scott Bernstein, as always.
One prediction I will make, though, I predict at some point, probably closer than not, he will end up in some type of media space and will be, whether it be on radio, television, streaming, someone will find a way to leverage his notoriety.
Scott, this. I think, I've made it pretty open. I've attempted to do it.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been
too.
We're working on stuff where we've attempted to do it. It's not easy. I think, and I'd say this till I'm blue in the face. I think getting him on some sort of show where he just talked about just stuff, it doesn't have to be mob, like just football or cigar. I mean, it'd be fascinatingly interesting. And, if he is smart enough, and I think he is, and from what I know, I'm sure he'll work on that. I mean, that's I think the end. And I agree, it will be somewhere. We'll see who it's with.
And then that would be a way. I mean, the way I've always pitched it is, the easiest way to get the government off your back is to have an income stream coming into your bank account that you can show, hey, this is where my money's coming from.
Absolutely.
And I think there's opportunities for him. I mean, who knows if he'll find them or if the people that have the opportunity in him will eventually connect. I know that, as you said, both we've been in some talks. There's been other people that have been in some talks and it hasn't happened. But I think eventually it gets done, and eventually you'll be able to consume him in some form of just like you said. He doesn't need to sit on there and talk about mob hits. No. If he just comes on and just talks about sports and golf and cigar, I think there's enough.
Keep in mind.
Yeah.
he did this in the 90s for free
Right.
on a radio station. So
Right.
time will tell. I guess we'll have to wait and see. If anything, I think it'll be interesting down the road. Scott Bernstein, The Gangster Report, Original Gangsters Podcast on YouTube, Spotify, Google. Go check it out. Scott's always bringing on and really kind of does. Him and I do a lot of the same similar things. I always like hearing his content.
Great interview with Grillo, by the way. He's amazing.
Yeah, he's a really interesting guy. You know, I'm trying to kind of meld into other things and try to find our footing elsewhere. But you know, Scott, it's always good to speak to you about Philadelphia.
Yeah. Thank you, Jeff. You do such a great job, man. And I'm not just shining you up. Like, to see someone that has an authentic, genuine interest in this stuff and wants to share the knowledge and spread the knowledge. And it's not just about, you know, blood and guts and you know, there's a lot of historically significant news here, I think. And I've always said that, you know, I'm a historian at heart, and I just want to chronicle a story for people. And this is the story that you live in, you know, out in Philadelphia, is probably the most profound, compelling mob story that there is right now. And you know, I just want to shout you out because you've done such a great job at building this brand. And again, just there aren't a lot of people out there that want to give genuine, authentic analysis with a genuine, authentic love of it, and it comes through in what you're doing.
And I appreciate that. And I learn from people like you. You know, it's always good to speak to people like you. And you're one of the kind of the guys now in this space. And it's just about keeping it all alive. This is a very interesting history of a group that, you know, essentially ran this country for a period of time. So it's important to keep the history alive. So Scott, good to see you. Good to hear from you. I'm sure we'll speak to you again soon. As I say, go check out Scott, The Gangster Report. I think really one of the best news authorities on the criminal world. And it's not just the mafia, also Original Gangsters Podcast. And I'm sure at some point, Scott, you and I will do another show and we'll work together again. Thank you for coming on. Seriously.
Thank you, man. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, good to see you. And thanks to everybody for joining us this week here on the Sit Down presented by Barstool Sports. We'll see you next week.